Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming out. Me, Bob, again. The Director of Programming here. I'd like to welcome you all to our special Halloween Eve screening of Theater of Blood with Vincent Price. Let's not upset the grandchild. Vincent Price is by far one of my favorite actors. All of his films are just elevated to a different level with his performance in it. Everything from his Edgar Allan Poe work to Dragonwyck to the Ten Commandments to a lot of his Roger Corman stuff, even all the way up to the very end with Tim Burton's Edward Scissorhands. He's just a fascinating actor to watch, and it's truly a treat to show Vincent Price. We get to do it twice a year here at the Colonial, usually in October and usually at Blobfest. So it's always fun to bring him back on our screen. And today we have this very special guest. We have his daughter, Victoria Price.
Hey everybody, that always happens when there's applause. And I'm Victoria, this is Allie, Vincent's granddog. I'm really excited to be here. I love coming to classic movie theaters, and Theater of Blood was one of those films in my dad's life. There were a number of them. House of Wax was one of them, Dragonwyck was one of them, and this was one of them, that it was sort of a before and after moment. In his personal life, he met my future stepmother in this movie. She called herself my wicked stepmother, which is never good. And he electrocutes her under a hairdryer. We'll talk a little more about that in the Q&A. So he met her during this movie, so his entire life, 23 years of marriage, ended after this movie, and he went on to a very different life. But also, besides that, this was sort of the last of his big starring roles, because horror movies took a kind of turn after this, and they became much more violent and graphic. And he ended up doing other things for a number of years. So Theater of Blood was really the culmination of all of the 60s, the Poe films, and then the Dr. Phibes films, everything that was filmed in England. And this movie was incredibly special to my dad because he was a huge Anglophile, and the cast in this movie is extraordinary. A lot of the top British actors, and my dad so admired the British theater and British film, and so for him to be in a film with all of these actors was a big deal. For me, of course, I was a huge fan of the Avengers growing up, and the fact that Diana Rigg was playing his daughter, I was 10 when he made this movie, and I remember, and she was tall, and I thought, I wonder if I'm going to grow up and be like Diana Rigg, pretty aspirational. So that was a big deal, to have Diana Rigg play his daughter. But this movie also, one of the things that you all need to remember is that horror movies were not what they are now. My dad was often derided and judged for making horror movies. They said, you went to Yale, you're a classically trained actor. Why are you making those kiddie films, those horror movies? So for him to play an actor who is critiqued and then to go out and seek his revenge and get it on all the critics, it was very near and dear to his heart. So those are some things for you to pay attention to. Allie will be leaving the theater during one scene. Those of you who know the movie will know the scene to which I refer, because Allie is part poodle, so she will have to leave. So I hope you enjoyed the film, and I have lots of fun stories to tell about it, and also answer a lot of your questions afterwards. So enjoy the movie.
Thank you so much.
That's bright.
That's bright.
Thank you.
All right. If anybody entered the raffle that John Wheatman set up today, we're going to call that winner after it's over, after the Q&A is over. But let's give it another round of applause for the film. I mean, fantastic. It's more than a horror movie. I think it's more of almost like a crime caper. I'm like watching this thinking of like David Fincher's Seven. And I'm like, wow, he's just like going through like check, check, check. But it's funny and it's sweet and endearing. I was like, what a Father's Day movie this could be. And Diane Rigg, she's amazing and so good. And the first time I saw it, I don't know why I didn't think that I just thought that was some guy, you know, very 70s, and then I'm like, oh, how did I not catch that right away? But nobody wants to hear me talk. We clearly want to hear you talk. And I guess one thing I did read about the film was that your father really was proud of his fencing skills, and this was an opportunity for him to use it, but then there was a stunt double, and a lot of those scenes didn't get in there. So if you could talk a little bit about that. I was fascinated that your father could fence.
You know, I'm sure it wasn't that great. He was not very athletic, my dad.
Those flips?
Yeah, those were
I mean,
him.
it was amazing.
You know, I just watched House of Wax. I was in Chicago a couple days ago at another great movie theater, and they were showing House of Wax, and it's always so easy for me to tell when it's my dad's double, you know, just because he had a very unique posture, and, you know, I can just immediately tell. So, yeah, the moment it switched, yeah, it was the double.
Why? Is it the? Can we have someone turn the music off up top? Because I'm hearing Danny Elfman. Yeah, it's Danny Elfman. Was it more than just the Anglophile, the cast, and being in England? What made it his favorite?
You know, when I interviewed Diana Rigg for the biography I wrote about my dad, one of the things she said to me was he was an incredible speaker of verse and nobody knew it. My dad loved poetry. He would actually pay me $1 as a kid. Like as a 9-year-old, for every Shakespeare soliloquy I memorized, he would recite poetry all the time. Now, my allowance was 25 cents a week, so I memorized a lot of soliloquies. But he loved poetry. He wrote poetry as a young man. He was a big fan of the Romantic poets, and he loved Shakespeare. So he had done Shakespeare on Broadway. He was in Richard III, actually was the year right after House of Wax with, I think, Jose Ferrer. Starred in it, and he loved doing Shakespeare, but he never really had the opportunity to do it as much as he would have wanted. And so this was an opportunity to play all the great Shakespearean roles, and that was an incredible opportunity for him, and to really show, yes, he was playing a camp actor, but even playing a camp actor, to be able to recite Shakespeare is not something everyone can do.
No, and not as eloquently as he could. So, slight divergence, because I literally was watching Batman 66 today with an Egghead episode in it with my son. And you watch a show like that, and he was so versatile. Was it just that he was very English in an acting style that he took work whenever it came? Or it was never, I'm not going to be on that. No, it was more like, look, work's work.
But not only that, you know, I was born, somebody just asked me in the lobby, how old was your dad when you were born? I mean, he was almost 51. And so he was in his 50s, and he didn't want to seem like the old dad with boring old friends. So he did a lot of those TV shows in the 60s and 70s because of me and my friends. He wanted to be relevant, and he preferred the company of young people to like old farts. That's what he would have said. Now we're all old farts, most of us in this room, let's be real. He loved doing things for kids, and it was fun. It was a way of seeing what young people were interested in, all the way down to, you know, doing Michael Jackson Thriller or Tim Burton. You know, he didn't want to do sort of pretentious things. So, yes, of course, he did a lot of things because it would allow him to buy art. But other things he did because he genuinely wanted to do things that young people would watch.
And in a lot of ways, it just kept his audience changing and growing and becoming younger each time. So here he was, this movie star, and then all those movies ended up on television, and then a whole new audience would find him, as my audience did. I was a child of the 80s, and I'm watching movies like this on a Sunday afternoon with my dad. It's such a weird question, but how was that growing up with Vincent Price, in some ways a boogeyman, as your father?
Well, I never really got it, you know? I mean, all my friends would say, oh, your dad's so scary, but the first time my parents ever took me to see my dad in something, I was about 4, and we went to see Captain Hook, which is a kid's play, and he was doing it live near our house. And I went with my mom. My mother was a really well-known costume designer, but she was also British and very, like stiff upper everything, And we went and we sat in the audience, and I saw my dad, who was just this sweet, loving person, and he was playing this bad guy, and he had a hook, and he was doing terrible things to the kids, and and I was terrified, and I kept saying to my mother, "What's wrong with Daddy? What happened to his hand? Why does he have a hook?" And I would not shut up. And my mother was mortified. So she had to take me backstage during intermission, which, is a no-no. You never do that. And so she took me backstage. Now, what I will say is that she wasn't obviously very concerned about my mental health, because while my dad was comforting me and telling me everything was okay, she was taking photographs. So there's a series of about 8 black and white photographs of me, like crying and upset, and then my dad showing me that the hook was a coat hanger, and then feeding me popcorn, and I was fine after that. But she was like, "I'm not doing that again." So they never let me see any of the scary stuff, so I never knew. And the first time I really got a glimpse that my dad was scary, so my dad was away all the time when I was a kid. He was making all the Poe films, and Allie, could you sit? Sit. Thank you. Down. Sit. And down. Down. Oh, yeah. I must have done something that irritated my mother, and my dad was home, and so she said to my dad, "You spank her." And I took one look at my dad. I was maybe like 7 or so, and I thought, he's old. I can outrun him. So I took off, and we lived in a 9,000 square foot house. So I started running, and I ran up the stairs figuring that would wear him out. What I neglected in my 7-year-old mind to calculate was that he had 6'4" legs. So he might have been old, but he was gonna catch up with me. So anyway, I'm running down this hall, and my dad is chasing me, and he's gaining on me. And I looked back, and I thought, oh, that's what they're talking about. Because it was Vincent Price chasing me down that hall. It was scary. But the really funny part was, so the house had this huge front entrance hall with this staircase that went all the way around it. And he caught up with me as we were coming down the staircase. And so he sort of perfunctorily turned me over his knee and spanked me, and then he sat down, sat me down next to him on the stairs, and he goes, "I don't want to ever do that again. So let's talk about how you cannot make your mom so mad." And that's what I always, and he was almost hysterical laughing at the idea that I had, just like in the movies, he thought the whole thing was hilarious. So, but he also knew that my mom was serious, so.
Well, this was his favorite. What was his least favorite? The one that made him cringe? And maybe it wasn't the movie itself, maybe it might have been the experience of making the movie.
So, if you have a 65-year career, 65, Allie. Al, it's really sad. Okay, you can go see Bob. If you have a 65-year career, you can't really distill it down to one. And so I would say this is one of his favorites, not his all-time favorite. He loved Laura from the 1940s. There was a film called The Eve of St. Mark he loved from the 40s. In the 50s, he loved doing the comedies, like Champagne for Caesar, but he also loved what House of Wax did for him. Then there were the Poe movies, and he loved the Dr. Phibes movies. So I'm not sure this was his only favorite, and also there wasn't just one film. For example, in the 1930s, he made a James Whale movie who directed Frankenstein, and it was terrible. The New York Times called it one of the worst movies ever made. And it was so bad that in an interview that he did with a French journalist in the late 80s, he remembered the dialogue because it was so bad, and he recited it because it was so terrible. And he said, how many actors can say they appeared in one of the worst movies ever made? He sort of took pride in it. Another one that he didn't like, not because it was a bad experience, but because it was filmed up in Montana in Glacier National Park. Nothing to do, bad food, no museums. So he called that movie, She Lost It in the Crevasse. I think it was called Dangerous Mission was the real name of it, but he never said much, positive about that. And it's really because he just didn't enjoy, like he wanted to be in a city, like he wanted to be in Rome filming. And another one that was really hard for him was Witchfinder General. Because the director was this young director. He didn't want my dad in the movie. He was forced to have my dad in the movie. He wanted Donald Pleasance. And he thought my dad was turning in this very sort of campy Uncle Vinny role. And at the end of the movie, my dad really understood what the director was trying to get out of him, but he really disagreed with how he went about getting it out of him. And it was a miserable filming experience for him. So I would say those are 3 examples of movies that were tough for him.
It's funny you bring up Witchfinder General. It's the one film of your father's I cannot stand to watch.
Because he's so malevolent.
Yes, and it's even in here he's a bad guy. Generally, he's a bad guy, but he's the bad guy you root for.
Right,
which
exactly.
I think is what draws us all to him in a lot of ways.
That's the Vincent Price, character. He's doing horrible things to people, and we're all like, yeah.
Yeah, he's enabling us to live out that revenge. And it's so strange, too, because you're not supposed to root for him. But a Witchfinder General, it just can't. I'm just like, no.
Yeah.
Once was enough, never again. We're going to open up to the audience. And just please stand up.
And Allie will take questions, too.
Yes.
The one movie I love is Son of Sinbad, because he gets the girl. Like, did you ever talk about that?
Yeah, it's actually a very funny story. So he was under contract to Howard Hughes. There were 3 actors. Howard Hughes at that point owned RKO. And he had 3 actors under contract. That's it. Big time actors. My dad, Jane Russell, and Robert Mitchum. But Howard Hughes also, was a ladies' man, as they were called in those days. And so all of these ladies, he put under contract at various times. They were starlets who had come. And so he'd had, this is enough. And so he had all these women under contract, and a lawyer came up to him from the studio and said, you have these women under contract and you owe them. They are in the contract obligated to appear in one movie, and they could sue you if you don't. He said, great, okay, let's write a screenplay with all the women. And that's how that movie came into being. So Howard Hughes really liked my dad, and he sent the script to him, and my dad said, it's terrible. And Howard Hughes said, yeah, it is, isn't it? Kind of gleefully. But there's a great story. So all these women, many of them, they were now housewives. They'd gone back to Iowa. They didn't want to appear in the movie, so they were hauled out to appear in this movie. But the great story about this movie, and I think you read the Book of Joe, so it's in that, in the Book of Joe. So in the movie, my dad, they filmed it sort of in the desert of California, and there were camels in the movie because it was supposed to be the desert of, like the Sahara. And so there was this one camel that kept disrupting all the scenes. And it was making all these really loud noises in the middle of filming. And so they brought in the camel trainer, and he's like, you gotta do something. This camel is disrupting all the scenes. And the trainer said, it's not a he, it's a she, it's a lady camel. That's what he called it. This was the 50s. And that's the sound that a lady camel makes when they're in love with someone. So they trotted the lady camel out to all the other camels. The camel didn't make that noise. And so they said, well, it could be a human. So they brought out all the men in the cast, nothing, until they brought out my dad. The lady camel had a crush on my father. So they had to separate my dad from the lady camel for all the filming scenes. Well, my dad thought it was the most ridiculous thing in the world. And so one night, they were filming out in the middle of nowhere. He thought, oh, this has got to have just been a joke. I'm going to go out, at night out to the camel stables and see if this is true. He got within, 20 yards of the lady camel, and out she came with the baying noises. She had a thing for my dad. So that was his predominant memory of that movie.
Wow.
Yeah, so... Yeah, probably not a Vincent Price story you'd heard?
No, not at all. Anyone else?
If Theater of Blood was to be made today, do you think that any current British actors would match up to the actors shown in this film? And do you have any ideas of who might fill those roles?
Ah, that's interesting. Well, I mean, there's the whole, Doctor Strange connection, right? So, I think we could have Benedict Cumberbatch as, that would be good, right? And let's see, for Diana Rigg's character, oh, that's a good question. I'm gonna have to think about that. Anybody have any idea for Diana, who's like a contemporary British actress for Diana Rigg's character? I'm trying to think.
Emily Blunt.
Oh, I like that. Emily Blunt would be good. Yes.
Someone said her daughter. Her daughter is an actress now,
Really?
too. Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah.
cool.
Yeah, I forget her name off the top of my head, but yeah. Anyone else? Another question?
I'd like to hear more about your father's interest in artistry and art collecting. Did he have particular artists that he was interested in collecting?
So my dad fell in love with the visual arts when he was a kid. And the very first thing he bought, he was 12 years old, and he grew up in St. Louis, and there weren't very many art galleries, but there was an excellent art museum. And he was walking by one of the art galleries, and he saw this beautiful thing, and he went inside, and he asked it was in the window, and he asked the gallerist about it, and the gallerist said it was a first state Rembrandt etching. And, to this day, I bless the gallerist who, took the time to talk to this 12-year-old boy. And my dad said, I would love to buy it. How much is it? It was $37.50. And so the gallerist made a deal with my dad, 3 years of allowance payments to pay off that $37.50. But that was the first piece of art he bought, a first state Rembrandt etching. And so he continued to buy art his entire life, bought his last piece of art 2 weeks before he died. And the thing was, he loved all art. So he particularly, his passion, I would say, was what is called primitive art, but art by indigenous cultures, Native American art, African art, oceanic art, art of Central and South America. But of Western art, what he loved collecting were drawings, because he felt like you could sort of see into the soul and the process of the artist through drawing. So he also, that was something he really collected. But he was an omnivorous collector. And one of the most interesting things he did was he started a program at Sears, which was then the biggest, department store in the world. And he bought over 20,000 pieces of art for Sears, personally, went all over the world buying them. And you could buy a Picasso or a Whistler or a Dali, an emerging artist, on your Sears credit card with a money-back guarantee. And he felt like this was a way that everybody could end up owning a piece of art, because he felt very strongly that art should not just be seen in museums, it should not be the province of the elite, it should be something everybody had access to. And I think that was one of the great contributions he made to the arts, although it's a chapter of his life that not a lot of people know about.
Were you able to visit him on the set, and do you have any memories of a particular film or performance?
Well, I'll have to tell a Peter Blood story. So he filmed a lot in England, and my mother was English, so we would go over. My mother it was very, very important to her that she never be one of those wives who was just hanging out on the set. First of all, she had her own career, but second of all, it was just important to her that he could focus on what he did. So we would usually come over for the last 2 weeks of the shoot. And often, for some reason, the shoots ended usually right before the holidays, so we would spend the holidays in England. But this was a summer shoot. So we came over, toward the end of the film. And unbeknownst to any of us, my dad was already, in love with Coral Brown, so that was a little awkward. But anyway, we had a driver. We often had a driver that was assigned by the studios. And this year, the driver was Cockney. And I was 10, I couldn't understand a word the man said. But my mother was English, so they were chatting away about whatever. Anyway, one day we went to see my dad on the set. And we were driving, and I, of course, wasn't listening to their conversation because I couldn't understand him. So I was looking out the window, and we always stayed in quite nice neighborhoods. But we were getting into like a worse and a worse neighborhood, which seemed kind of weird. And then we ended up in this kind of warehouse area, and everything was kind of falling apart. And we stop here, and I'm thinking, like, this is weird. And so the driver gets out and opens my door, and I'm kind of, like, this is weird. And then I notice that he's gotten back in the car. My mother hasn't gotten out of the car, and I'm standing alone in front of this, like, crumbling old warehouse, and all of a sudden, all of these like homeless, toothless people with like scabs and sores come running out of this building and come up to me and start pawing me, kind of like the scene with, you know, the second critic who gets killed. And they're asking me for money, and I'm 10 and I'm just terrified. And then out comes my father, my hero. He sweeps out of the building and he says, "You people, get away from her. She is my daughter." And he puts his arm around me and sweeps me into the theater, neglecting to tell me, so I didn't know until years later when I finally watched the movie, that they were all extras and he had put them up to.
Any more questions? Sir.
Just a week ago, for the first time, I saw Dr. Goldfoot in the bikini machine.
Movie that would never be made today.
I figured you were about 6 or 7 years old at the time. Did your dad feel any kind of trepidation or some degree of risk when he accepted that role?
You know, the thing about my dad was he was the least pretentious person on the planet. And he could have been pretentious. You know, he went to an Ivy League school and he grew up a wealthy kid, but he just had fun doing whatever. You know, he just, I mean, this was a man who, you know, sold mildew cleaner, you know, on commercials. You know, I don't, and what we have to remember is that the sort of the perspective we have now of how ridiculously sexist it is not the perspective. You know, I mean, it's a digression, but I know a lot of you are Elvira fans, and there's a clip where he is, you know, on a talk show with Cassandra Peterson, but she's, you know, Elvira. And I watch my dad and I think, Dad, that's like perilously close to sexist, his behavior. And, you know, she loved him and he loved her. It was sort of a generational thing, you know. He had no concept that it was sexist, you know. And so, no, I think he just thought, oh, this is fun, this is what the kids are watching, and it's Frankie, you know, oh, sure, what the heck, and it's sort of peculiar and strange, and why not, you know, so, no.
All right, is that it?
Go on.
Do you have any personal poetry or any art or sketches that your father did himself?
You know, for about 5 or 10 years before my dad died, he said, I just want to have a big garage sale and get rid of everything. But, you know, we went through and gave everything to all the auction houses, but there were things that, you know, were personal things, and I ended up with them in a box in storage, and I used a lot of them when there were many boxes, and I used a lot of them to research the biography that I wrote. But years later, they were still sitting in boxes, and this little voice in my head said, he always said and actually after he did die, I did have garage sales, and where I just sold things. That's what he wanted. He didn't want it to be pretentious. And then eBay came along, and I thought, well, you know, that's kind of like a global garage sale. So years ago, I mean, I'm going to say, you know, 15 years ago, I started selling things on eBay, and it was so much fun because people began putting together these amazing collections, and there are incredible collections of, you know, people who had, you know, they collected a certain thing, like they liked the poetry or the art. And so, no, it's all gone. You know, what I kept are the things that mean something to me. And they're really things that I had a relationship with, let's say maybe an object, or my dad and I had a relationship to, and the things that I kept had meaning to me, but not so much, you know, like, you think about the things that you love of your parents or a sibling or a friend, you know, it's not necessarily, it might not be the most valuable thing. It's the thing that you have, you know, a fond spot for. So it was really fun to let it all go and know that there are people who are caretaking it and loving it. And every so often I told people I'm a nomad, so I have a storage unit in Santa Fe, New Mexico. And every so often when I'm back in Santa Fe, I'll open one of the few remaining boxes and I'll look like, oh, look at that. And then, so there's still a pile of stuff that at some point when I have the time, I'm gonna put back on eBay. And it really brings me this joy to think it's gonna go to somebody who really loves it, because I have the stuff that I really love. you know? But more than that, I mean, I have the good fortune of carrying my dad in my heart, you know? And the few things that I love, you know, that's it, that's all I need.
Last question there in the back. Chuck.
Yeah, so some years ago I came across this great photo of your father at Dodger Stadium slinging hot dogs. And I read that he did that as just an interesting thing he liked cooking. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, so that came out of Sears. So my dad loved to cook. Well, let's go to first, he loved to eat. My dad loved to eat. And so when he really loved something, he would talk to a chef and he'd say, oh my gosh, I'd love to try that. And first of all, in those days, I think it wasn't like it is now where chefs guard their recipes. But second of all, I think my dad could, you know, get probably the nuclear code out of Joe Biden, you know. I mean, he just was so, you know, anybody would give my dad anything. So he would collect these recipes, and my mom was a designer, and she would collect different design elements from countries that they visited, and they would recreate these meals for their friends. Well, when my parents were both working for Sears, this executive at Sears said, you should do a cookbook. And that's how that cookbook came about. In 1965, it was published, and it was called A Treasury of Great Recipes, and it was the recipes they'd collected. And it was really about, you know, getting people out of thinking like a TV dinner is good enough, and the beginning of this beautiful coffee table kind of cookbook that inspired people to, you know, become the culture that we are now, a foodie design culture, you know? And so, but it was not pretentious. That was the most important thing. Yes, there were very expensive restaurants in there, but they were also recipes for things that were their favorite things. And my dad was a huge, both my parents were huge Dodger fans, and Dodger Stadium was super famous for its Dodger dogs. And so that's where that hot dog picture came from. They're at Dodger Stadium. It's my dad, my mom, and my godparents, and they're at Dodger Stadium eating a Dodger dog, and in the cookbook is a recipe for hot dogs. By the way, I just have to say this, go Phillies, because you've got to beat those Astros. Anybody who can beat those Astros, but I'm all for the Phillies. Go Phillies, National League anyway, all the way.
Victoria, thank you so much. The Colonial thanks you. You made our October even more special by being here. She does have books out front, everybody. I think there's still a couple of the Theater of Blood posters left.
Do you guys have time for one more story?
Oh, please, please.
Okay. You know, I've only done a few events since the pandemic, and so I haven't told this story in a long time, and I just feel like telling it because it's kind of one of the last evenings I spent with my dad. So, as a little kid, you know, I had unusual parents, right? And they valued going to museums and reading books, and so all my friends' families, like, I'd hear what they did for the weekend, and they played board games. And I was like, that sounds so much fun. Why can't we play board games? And my parents were like, because we're taking you to Paris, because we're taking you to a museum. And I'm like, can't we play Monopoly? I just want to play Monopoly. Well, I guess I was so obnoxious that finally one year, we were in England, they laid out on the table like it was the crown jewels, something that was clearly going to be a board game. You know, it was that rectangular shape and it made that noise. And I opened it, so excited that we were finally going to be a regular family and play Monopoly or Candyland or something. And what was it? Masterpiece. Guess the auction prices of fine works of art. I was 8. So we take out the game and they're so excited, and you know, they show some obscure, you know, piece of art, and you have to guess what the auction price was. So I'm, you know, 8, I'm like $300, you know, I don't know. And my mother guesses that, my father writes down his guess, and you know, then they reveal the answer, and the person who's closest to it gets to move their thing around the board. Well, they reveal the answer, this is on the first thing, and my dad goes, that is incorrect, it sold 2 weeks ago at Sotheby's for, you know, $1.2 million. That was the last board game we ever played. Okay, so cut to the end of his life, and my dad is now sharp as a tack. He beats me at Jeopardy every time we play it, and we start playing board games. Companies send my dad People were asking me about Roddy McDowell. Well, people send my dad sort of prototypes of board games, and one of them we played with Roddy McDowell because it was all photographs of celebrities. But the game we played most often was Trivial Pursuit. And we always divided into two teams. It was my dad, my brother, and me, and my sister-in-law, the guy who took care of my dad, and usually some friend of mine. And because this was LA in the early 90s, we were the Bloods and they were the Crips. Well, long story short, my brother is one of the most intelligent people I know. I feel like I'm fairly well educated and well read. We never had to answer one question because my dad knew all of them. And so we always won. And what was so satisfying about this was that my sister-in-law was the most competitive person on the planet. And it just bugged her. So long story short, they come out to visit. My dad is now, increasingly unwell, and they've started to put him on some morphine. But he says, let's play Trivial Pursuit. So we all sat, he had a big California king-size bed. So we all sat on the bed, and he said, if I nod out a little, just keep playing. So sure enough, we're playing along, and he's doing well, and he starts to nod out a little. And we all look at each other and like, should we stop? And, he said, no, keep playing. So we keep going, and my brother and I soldier on, and we make it to the end. And, you get to that thing where then the opposite team gets to choose the question for you. So my sister-in-law always chose science and nature. It was our, weak link. So she picks science and nature out, and she gets this gleam in her eye, and she's looking at the question, and she's got that look like, you are never gonna get this, and without him, you are sunk. So she asks us, what does a man have more than two of if he is polyorchid? And my brother and I look at each other and we have no clue. We look over at my dad and he is just sound asleep on the morphine. And what's completely irritating about the whole thing is just on the other side of the wall behind the bed is my dad's orchid collection. He grew orchids. We knew he would know. So we're going through all the things men have two of, and we're not getting any closer. And finally, we're about to hand back the card and admit defeat, and we feel the bed stir. And we look over at my dad, but he's still passed out. Well, this inspires my brother and me, and we think, okay, we're gonna try. We have no idea. So literally, we're handing the card over when we feel the bed really move. And we look over, and there is my dad. And with the last ounce of his strength, he is hoisting himself up by his elbows, and he says, balls! And we won the game.